John sat in his car, watching the police department where he had worked for the past few years. He was an experienced officer, but lately, his heart had been uneasy. It seemed that he had become part of the system he once swore to protect. His thoughts were weighed down by a particular case that had been haunting him for weeks. John hadn't been prepared for what happened after a pursued case in which he had broken the rules. It was a small matter: Mary, a middle-aged woman, who, according to some colleagues, should have been warned for careless driving in a speed limit zone. But John decided to be lenient, giving her a warning instead of a ticket. This decision marked the beginning of a great problem for him. A few weeks later, Mary filed a complaint, and not without reason. She accused him of being unfriendly during the stop and unnecessarily intimidating her, even though John hadn't raised his voice. Everyone around him began to feel that he was in the wrong, and instead of addressing the situation, John started hiding his actions. He realized he had fallen into a trap, and what initially seemed like a small misunderstanding had turned into a big problem. Mary, on the other hand, was not someone who would tolerate being mistreated. She filed a lawsuit, seeking justice. She spoke about how John had treated her, her nerves, and the bitter experience of interacting with police officers who often abused their power. John couldn't believe this was happening to him. All these years, he had built his career on always standing for truth and justice. But now, his name had become part of a scandal. He didn't know what to do, how to fix his mistake. He felt anger and frustration, but also shame before the people who had begun to doubt his honesty. At the court hearing, John saw Mary. She was calm, even composed, as she spoke before the judge. Her words weren't aggressive, but they were impactful. She wasn't asking for anything beyond justice. In her eyes, there was no anger, only a deep understanding that the truth needed to be heard. As the case gained momentum, John felt his pride shrinking in his chest. He knew the only way to fix the situation was not to fight against Mary, but to try to understand her point of view. And although he felt scared and ashamed, he decided to engage in dialogue. He reached out to his colleagues, supporting Mary in her right and honesty. John met Mary after the hearing. She was sitting on a bench in front of the courthouse, carefully reviewing some papers. He approached her, feeling his heart race, and took a deep breath. "Mary, I want to apologize," he said, stopping beside her. His voice was quiet but firm. "I understand that my actions were unacceptable. I truly disappointed you, and I am deeply ashamed of what happened." Mary lifted her eyes, and there was no anger or aggression in her gaze. Just calm, which was so different from what John had expected. "John, I wasn't looking for revenge," she replied, putting the papers into her bag. "I just want the people we are supposed to respect to understand that we can't compromise on the truth. And you, too, ultimately deserve to be honest with yourself. That's all." His heart trembled when she added, "I don't want to come across like I'm trying to impose my point of view. But I believe that if people open up to each other, if they are ready to listen, they will find the right solution even in the most difficult situations." John remained silent, realizing the depth of her words. He had truly begun to understand that the problem wasn't just with her complaint, but also with how he had acted. He had never stopped to consider how his actions might affect others. "Mary, I want to fix my mistake," he said after a few seconds of silence. "I don't promise it will be easy, but I am ready to do everything to show that I've changed." Mary smiled, and a noticeable ease appeared on her face. She extended her hand. "That's all I want to hear, John. Just be genuine and honest. That's what matters." They shook hands, and John felt the tension weighing on his shoulders lift slightly. Mary wasn't his enemy, but rather a reflection of what he needed to see in himself. John returned home with a clear mind. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but this step had already been important. He had to find a way to change not just his behavior but also the entire system that allowed such mistakes to happen. He began to review his work with a new perspective, not as a police officer, but as a person who needed to serve, not dominate. The very next day, John scheduled a meeting with the department leadership. He didn't blame others but emphasized the need to be more attentive to everyone they served. "We need to learn to be human again before becoming police officers," he said at the beginning of the meeting. "It's important to remember that everyone deserves dignity and respect." A deep sense of responsibility filled his heart. This was only the first step, but he felt he was moving in the right direction. And even if the path was long and difficult, John was ready to walk it. Because he knew, a small step could become the beginning of great change. John felt the significance of each step that brought him closer to change. After he finished his meeting with the department leaders, he sensed the atmosphere around him gradually shifting. His colleagues no longer looked at him with suspicion, and although doubts remained, he had managed to awaken at least some trust. It was only the first step, but he knew he couldn't stop there. Meanwhile, Mary seemed to have not changed her stance at all. She held no grudge against John, but after that incident, their paths, of course, diverged a little. She continued with her activism, and although it was hard to return to everyday life after what had happened, she felt that she had made the right choice. One day, a few weeks after John had publicly apologized and began changing his approach, he received a phone call from Mary. She asked if he could meet for a brief conversation. John, a bit surprised, agreed. They met at a small cafe on the street, where a quiet atmosphere prevailed. Mary was calm, almost thoughtful, as they sat at the table. "I want to thank you, John," she began. "You've done a lot to change the system. It's not easy for you, and I see that you are working not just to change yourself but to change others too. That's important." John smiled, feeling the weight of heavy thoughts lift. "These are just the first steps," he said. "But I understand that it won't stop here. I want to be part of the change, so it can truly happen." Mary nodded and looked at him with a touch of sadness in her eyes. Change begins with understanding that no one is untouchable. And you've understood that. But it's important not to stop after the first victories. The problems won't disappear, and they need to be fought at all levels. John paused for a moment, watching the people outside the window hurrying about their business, and a sense in his heart told him that he was on the right path. But with every new thought, he realized, the road he was on was only just beginning. "Mary, I haven't forgotten why I'm doing this. And I understand that even small steps matter. We need to be patient and not back down. I want to fight for justice, but to do it in a way that makes everyone feel equal." Mary looked at him with understanding and tenderness. "That's real change, John. Not everyone has the courage to act as you have. You're not just learning from your mistakes, you're setting an example for others. And that's worth it." John realized that every conversation, every action, every choice he made mattered. And though this path would be difficult, he was ready to move forward because he understood that change began with him. In the end, he returned to work with a new goal. He continued to collaborate with colleagues, paying more attention to their needs and trying to create a just atmosphere. But on this path, there were also tough moments when he had to confront prejudices and stereotypes that had been ingrained in his profession for years. But the most important thing John learned was that even a small step, even a single day when you choose to be honest with yourself and others, can be the beginning of great change. Sometimes, just one moment is enough to change the course of events. And that moment was already on the horizon. A few weeks later, John felt that his efforts were finally starting to pay off. He had become more open with his colleagues, asking for their advice, listening attentively, and offering support. But internally, he understood that the changes he was striving for would not be immediate. While the atmosphere in the team began to shift, he felt that he needed to take one more important step. One day, as he sat at his desk reviewing documents, his attention was drawn to a new letter from management. He opened it with interest. The letter announced that there would be an important meeting next week to discuss the company's development strategy. It was clear that this meeting would be an opportunity for him to take another step on his path toward change. On the day of the meeting, John was prepared. He had long since come up with a few ideas that he thought could help the company become more open and honest in its approaches to working with clients and partners. He didn't plan to push his ideas aggressively, but he wanted to share them with his colleagues and management to show that even large organizations could be flexible and human. When the meeting began, John felt a slight nervousness. He saw how some colleagues sat, deep in thought, while others seemed to already have prepared answers to all the questions. They discussed various strategies that would make the company stronger in the market. But John felt that this time, he couldn't sit quietly. He raised his hand and asked for the floor. "I'd like to share a few ideas that might not be entirely typical for meetings like this," he began, slightly nervous but confident in his words. "Maybe we should reconsider not only our strategies regarding clients but also how we interact within the company. Honesty, openness, and support within the team are the foundation of our development." His words hung in the air, and for a few seconds, there was silence in the room. But then one of the managers, whom John had always considered somewhat cold and distant, looked up and stared at him. "Interesting idea, John," he said, slightly grim. "But do you have something specific in mind?" "We work according to clear rules, and often they are a reliable mechanism that helps keep everything under control." John didn't get flustered and continued. "I mean that we could create a more flexible environment where everyone feels supported not only by management but also by colleagues. I believe this would help us not only be more effective but also create an atmosphere where everyone can grow." After a few minutes of discussion, the meeting continued with the usual agenda, but his words did not go unnoticed. John noticed how the looks of some colleagues became less distant, and a few even began to participate in the conversation. He had managed to influence the atmosphere, even though he didn't achieve immediate results. At the end of the meeting, one of his colleagues approached John. "You spoke well, John. Maybe you didn't move mountains, but the fact that you raised this issue already means something important. Don't stop." These words were significant to John. He knew that the changes wouldn't be quick, but every step brought him closer to his goal. Soon, John got another chance when it became known that management planned to launch a new initiative to improve corporate culture. John decided to propose his idea based on what he had started discussing at the meeting, and this time his support was considerable. Over time, more and more people began to support John's initiatives. He felt that he could act not only within the confines of his responsibilities but also at the company level as a whole. And although the path to complete change was long, he knew that with every step, he was getting closer to creating an environment that supports not only the business but also the people working within it. A few months later, John realized that his initiatives had started gaining popularity among his colleagues, and this had brought him new opportunities. He became increasingly involved in strategic meetings, where his ideas became important components of the discussions. However, he also noticed that there were still many barriers in the way of real change. One day, after a long meeting, he sat in a cafe with one of his colleagues, Mike, who was more experienced and skeptical about these changes. "I see you're trying to do everything you can to change the atmosphere in the company," Mike said, taking a sip of his coffee. "But do you really understand that many people aren't ready for such changes?" John paused for a moment, looking at his friend. "I understand that not everyone agrees, but I believe that if we try to change even a few small things, it could be the start of bigger changes," he replied. Mike smiled. "You might be right. But here's the thing, most people aren't ready to change quickly. Especially when it comes to their comfort." John furrowed his brow, realizing that his enthusiasm might not be fully understood by everyone. But he was convinced that the path to change lay in the little things. For example, creating small groups to exchange ideas or organizing informal meetings where people could talk about issues that might not always be discussed in official meetings. A while later, John organized the first such event. He proposed holding an open space for employees, where everyone could express their thoughts and suggestions without fear of being judged. The idea was simple but powerful, to create an atmosphere of trust where people could openly discuss issues. As expected, the first event didn't attract a large number of people, but even the few employees who attended began to feel that their opinions mattered. One of the participants was Alex, who worked in the marketing department and often felt isolated due to his introverted nature. "This was interesting," Alex said after the meeting. "I never thought I could openly say what really bothers me about our work. Maybe we need more meetings like this." John smiled, feeling that his ideas were slowly gaining momentum. He began to understand that change doesn't always come quickly, but when it does, it's the result of gradual, small steps. A few weeks later, John raised the issue of the importance of corporate culture again at the next meeting. This time, his words started receiving more support. Gradually, more colleagues agreed that it was necessary to maintain flexibility and mutual support within the team. And then, what John had been waiting for happened. Management decided to launch a new initiative related to the development of corporate culture. As part of this initiative, it was decided to implement team-building training and organize more informal events for the staff. "You changed the atmosphere in the company," Mike said when he heard the news. "You did it, even though it was through small steps." John smiled. "This is just the beginning. Now it's important to keep moving forward, helping each of us feel like part of something bigger." With each new step, John felt the company beginning to change for the better. And although there was still much work to be done, he knew that he had initiated a process of change that would not only benefit him but everyone working alongside him. Time passed, and John felt how the changes in the company became more and more noticeable. The corporate culture was gradually becoming more open and flexible, and people began to trust each other more. All the initiatives he had started, which had seemed small at the beginning, began to yield results. Employees were becoming more motivated, and even those who had initially been skeptical of the changes could now be seen among the active participants. However, he knew that the changes wouldn't stop there. Every small step, every conversation, every meeting was part of a bigger picture that required constant renewal and support. So, he continued working, seeking new ways to engage colleagues in discussions of ideas, even when the meetings became less frequent. One day, after a long meeting, the company's manager approached John with an unexpected question. "John, you've worked hard to change the atmosphere in the company. How do you see our next steps?" John thought for a moment. He realized that now, when the changes had started to bear fruit, he could view the situation from a new perspective. "The next steps are to support these changes," he replied confidently. "We need to maintain openness and support the new initiatives so that people not only adapt but grow along with the company." The manager nodded, clearly pleased with the answer. "You're right. We really are on the path to great changes. Thank you for your initiative, John. You made this possible." This was what he had been waiting for, the moment when his ideas and efforts were recognized. John felt that this was not only his victory but the victory of the entire team. He had proven to himself and others that big changes start with small but important steps. As John left the office that evening, he felt harmony in his heart. He had managed to change not only the atmosphere at work but also his colleagues' attitude towards their work and each other. But, most importantly, he realized that true change always starts with the individual. And if he could do it, then he could continue to influence the world around him. With a smile on his face, John looked at the future, at new opportunities and challenges, ready for the next steps in his career and life. A few months later, John stood at the threshold of the changes he had long desired. He had not only overcome injustice in his company but had also learned an important lesson about the power of dialogue and a calm yet persistent approach to resolving conflicts. Mary, although she left the company after the lawsuit, found a new job. But unlike her previous one, she was now more attentive to how employees were treated in each organization. She remained grateful for the opportunity that this story had given her, to change her attitude towards the situation and learn to stand up for her rights. John continued working, but now with greater responsibility and confidence in himself. He understood that even in the most difficult situations, when it seemed that everything could only be resolved through force, real change comes through understanding and mutual respect. He saw how employees gradually changed, how they began to discuss their problems more openly, how even the most oppressed voices were given a chance to be heard. And he knew that this was just the beginning. Change doesn't happen in one day, it continues until every step becomes part of a larger process that moves the world towards a better future. One day, John stood in his office room, looking out the window at the endless streets of the city. He was calm. He was confident. And most importantly, he knew that even one person who chooses to act with kindness and understanding can change something big. And he was ready for the next steps that would lead him to even greater achievements. Instead of leaving his mark in the company only as a leader, John became a symbol of change for everyone who faced challenges. And this was his most valuable victory. The story of John and Mary was ending, but it remained in the memory of those who saw how a small act of kindness and justice could change life for the better. And that was what they both had: hope.